Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and I'm excited to be here talking to you today about deadlines because we all love deadlines, right? Deadlines are an essential part, a necessary part of our lives because if we didn't have deadlines, I, for one, would probably not get anything done because I'm one of those people who likes to keep expanding the possibilities, exploring. I'm a researcher after all. And the one thing that I have learned in my research, a colleague, Omar, actor, actually said, drilled this into me. It's all about outlines and deadlines. So, outlines, what you're going to do, deadlines, when you're going to deliver. And one thing I've learned is to set what I call, quote, impossible deadlines, meaning what would happen if you had a really hard deadline to meet? And we'll talk about how you can use this in a positive way. But I also want to talk about how you can use it in a bad way to help impossible deadlines, unrealistic deadlines have become a part of management and leadership techniques, which I think is a detrimental way to be leading. So, the thing I would like to say is to say, let's rethink how we use deadlines, how we set, quote, impossible deadlines to actually drive innovation, to drive ingenuity, to drive disruption. So today, what I'd like you to do is, as you're joining, to please share how do you use deadlines to drive innovation and ingenuity? Because when you don't have enough time, you don't have enough resources to deliver something, that's when innovation comes in. That's when ingenuity in particular comes in. And the focus of this is a new report that my company, PA Consulting, just put out last week called A New Way to Lead. And one of the things that we mentioned in there is that the use of impossible deadlines, of tough deadlines, to imagine what it could look like if you had less time, because it allows you to focus on the most important things. And this is a key part of working in what I call the growth mindset. So we'll talk today about how to have a growth mindset around deadlines rather than having this stressful, really beaten down, demoralized approach to thinking about deadlines. So let's first of all talk about bad, impossible deadlines. We've all been parts of these types of teams where we've had somebody come up to us and a manager says, we need this done ASAP. We have 2 weeks to deliver on something. But instead of telling you it's actually 2 weeks, as they've been told that, they're going to tell you have 1 week to deliver it. And it cascades down because the person who asked that person to deliver in 2 weeks probably had like a month. And so everyone is hedging, trying to do to over deliver and set lower expectations. So under promise, over deliver. But what happens as a result are these impossible deadlines that seem very arbitrary. And when the team first gets that and says, you want us to do what? In how much amount of time? That's impossible. And the manager goes, we just got to do it. We just got to bust our butts, get really focused on this, and pull out all the stops, get everybody to come on and focus on this, drop everything else, and get this done. And the result is you get stressed, the quality is bad, we make mistakes, and in the end, it leads to a lot of conflict and mistrust because why did this happen? How are we able to do that? How are we actually going to do this? And at the end of it, like, oh, we delivered on time within somewhat of the scope. And then we're told, oh, we actually have a few more days or another week to now perfect this. And it just throws everything into a tizzy because if you had known what the real deadline is, you would have not had to go back and fix all the work. You would have done it correctly right from the very beginning. So this is a downward spiral that just leads to nowhere. And some of the assumptions around this is, again, building the buffer time to be able to figure out what you actually need to get done. And you don't trust everybody to get things done by a certain time. And we also believe that there's something going on called a student syndrome, where the work expands to fill the time available. So if you know you have a paper due in 2 weeks, you're just going to keep doing it until the very end of it, finish everything up in the last 3 days, and instead of using that time in a productive way. So the other perspective of this is, what if we use deadlines and the scope and then also the resources we have available to actually think about how to keep everyone aligned. And I wanted to share with you, again, this is a common thing in project management, which is you look at the time, the scope, and the cost. This is classic project management. It's called the iron triangle. And you have to have all of these three things figured out so you know and agree on what the quality is going to be at the end, too, as well. And one of the dangers of this is that when you are thinking about reducing the time that you have available, then how are you going to scope down the scope or potentially increase the cost to be able to keep the scope but meet the time deadlines? And another way to think about this is more like a balancing act. You have scope on one side, and then time and cost. And if you're going to squeeze the time, then you're going to have to increase the cost or reduce the scope to balance things off. So these are all about trade-offs. And instead of thinking about this as an absolute, I encourage us to think about this as a thought experiment, as a way at the beginning of the project to say, how could we actually think about this in a creative way? What if we had less time? If we had, for example, an 8-month project, how would we cut it down to 10 weeks? Which seems impossible, right? But think about it instead of an absolute that we have to do it this way, how would we actually scope the work down to fit within 10 weeks? And the things that you learn along in that process is well, these are the three things that are most important to deliver. These are the most important cost drivers that we have to have. If we have that constraint of time actually zeroed into a completely unreasonable, impossible time, how would things change? So if you were to squeeze it down to an hour, a day, a week, a month, a much larger project, how would you focus and change things? And what I think this does, it actually creates a very interesting situation here, which is when you actually do this, you get very focused on what is the most important thing to deliver. What are the must-haves in terms of the scope? Because the way most projects are written, the way most things are done, you include everything. You put everything into that scope. This is what it would absolutely look like. And yet we know there's an 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule says 80% of the value is created with 20% of the effort. And so what this exercise of impossible deadlines does is it focuses on that 20% of the effort that's absolutely needed to deliver 80% of the project, 80% of the outcomes. So this is a key part because instead of saying we're going to do this project in 8 weeks instead of 10 months, what would it actually look like? What would we have to do? What are the corners we would have to cut? What are the compromises we have to make? What are the increases in costs? If costs are constrained and time is constrained, then the scope has to be constrained down to the most essential parts. And this then allows us to have a much better focus on what is absolutely important. So we have a couple comments out here. So first of all, we have Anglatine. So thank you for commenting. She says that I think having impossible deadlines helps us think creatively and out of the box thinking, looking for efficiencies, etc., as long as it is not causing employees to be burnt out by overstretching. And that would I totally agree with that because it's a great place to be. If everyone is in alignment, that the purpose of looking at these deadlines and squeezing the deadlines is to give us focus and alignment. But it also requires as a leader that you monitor people very closely to say, are we getting stressed? Are we getting stressed instead of stretched? Because stretching is great. We see it as a challenge. We rise to a higher level of performance. We bring out ingenuity within ourselves and in our teams. But stress is not a good thing. So being able to monitor that. Jay has a great point here, which is, are we being creative here? Or are we firefighting because, well, presumably because of poor planning or because of unexpected contingencies, negative externalities that are happening over there? And it just adds that this is basically at the core trust. Trust is the core to ensuring that there's quality because false deadlines undermines trust. So these are really good points that you both are being Eglatine and Jay, that the most important part here is that in the team, when we set these, quote, again, impossible deadlines, things that just seem there's no way we could deliver this project in a short amount of time. And that's true because something has to give. Your scope, the time, the cost, something has to be moved around there, because just saying you're going to deliver the same thing in the same amount of time with the same amount of people and resources is completely unrealistic, impossible. So it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. How do we think about setting impossible deadlines and what to do about this when you're facing them? I'll give an example. I once had to completely redo a presentation. I got into the venue. I got there ahead of time. I was looking forward to taking a little bit of time off. It was in a really fun city. And they said, we had a change in plans. The speaker before you is going to be talking about the same exact topic. Can you change your topic? So I had less than 24 hours to get that revised, completely revamp my presentation. And, what do you do when you face an impossible deadline like this? Well, I could stress out and really pull out the stops, or I could sit there and go, okay, what do I do? So the first thing to think about is, more than anything else, you've got to take care of yourself, focus on your well-being. How much time can you devote to this? How much effort? Because you still need to eat, sleep, drink water, and make sure you get plenty of sleep in order to be at your best. So making sure those constraints are put on top of that. And then focusing on what's the most essential. When I looked at the constraints of what I only had so much time. I knew what the audience was looking for. I knew what the other speakers were talking about now. And then I could really focus on what were the biggest takeaways for that audience. And then from that, created a presentation that just focused on those takeaways, stripped out every other possible thing, and just focus and deliver that. And it was great because I could focus. And at the same time, I wanted to make sure I enjoyed this city. So I knew I would want to go out and have a great lunch at a certain place and then take a walk, think about it, but then set aside time in between to think about the presentation. And that separation actually gave me more focus to be able to do that. So when you're facing impossible deadlines like this, first of all, focus on your well-being. What's the most essential? And then focus on actually the outcome. Focus on the delivery, not the impossible aspect of this. How do you change the scope? How do you work with that existing, the time constraint you have, and what resources do you have available? And I think the last thing is think about what other resources you can pull in. Who are the other people you can involve? This is not something that you alone have to take on. It's something that other people can do too as well. So I just want to see if there's other comments here. I see another one. I can't quite get to it. Let's see. We have Rania who's saying it's a matter of prioritization and urgency. What's most important and how soon do you need it? There are, again, a great point to talk about that too as well. Now, there are different techniques that you can use, such as agile or waterfall, to talk about how you manage time and the cost constraints in different ways. Jay has a great example about how about chunking it down to smaller deliverables to make sure that we're hitting these milestones along the way, so that it doesn't feel like it's something overwhelming, but you can check in and see. And again, the foundations of an agile process and ways to break down the scope, the deadlines, and the costs into more manageable pieces, and therefore be able to adjust and make that balancing act between scope, costs, and time much more realistic. And when you set these shorter deadlines. The last couple of things I would encourage you to think about are some mindset things, because I began this by talking about this new report that we have out. I'm just going to post up the report lead so you can see. This is the URL for it. It's a report called A New Way to Lead. And again, one of the things that we encourage people to do is to work in that growth zone, have that growth mindset. And one of the ways to set that is with these impossible deadlines. So a couple of things to keep in mind as you're working in this growth zone. The first one is that one person could see something as impossible. Another person could see it as a challenge. And how you enter into these discussions is a really important thing. So it encourages you to think about the types of people you have on the team. How do they respond to impossible situations? Do they respond to it with curiosity or do they freeze? And how do you create that environment, create that space so that people have the right mindset walking into those situations? The other thing is to make sure that people have and understand that this is going to be uncomfortable. This is going to be hard. We talk about being in this messy middle where we don't know how things are going to work out, but we know where we're starting from and where we want to end up. But in that middle space can be incredibly uncomfortable. And again, being in that growth zone means being also that a little bit of uncomfortableness, hopefully not too much where you're again stressed, but you are stretched and challenged and feel alive and connected with the other team members to accomplish this. And then the last part is when you're going through this process, there will be some people who will say, well, that's ridiculous. This is impossible. We can't do this. And this is where that optimism, I talked about this last week, where optimism becomes such an important part. This is not toxic positivity where we go, we can do this. Failure is not an option. That is not what I'm talking about. It's saying, I believe as the leader of this team in our ability to rise to this occasion. I believe that we have the right people, we have the strengths, we have the capabilities, we have the right mindsets to be able to go through this and think about these deadlines that could be impossible, that it will allow us to develop this trust, this alignment on what we want to get done. And then set that aggressive timeline. Set it to be aggressive, not impossible, but that impossible deadline will have given you so much more insights into what is really important. Create that alignment, create that trust that is so important for innovation and disruption and ingenuity to happen. All right, so that's what I have for today. I wanted to really just talk about this one little piece of an idea. Again, this setting of impossible deadlines. It's not a really big, like earth shattering idea, but it's something that we can apply every single day for ourselves and for our teams. How do we think about deadlines in a creative way? Use it as a way to say, what could I do if I had less time? Because it'll help us focus and prioritize and align on what's truly important. As I like to say, if the 80-20 is rule, why are we spending 80% of the time trying to figure out the last 20%? Let's focus on the 20% of the time that would deliver the vast majority of the outcomes and get to that point where we'll have a different perspective to be able to say what else is actually needed now to finish the rest of this project to deliver. All right, that's what I have for today. Join me next week. I'll be actually in Ireland, in Dublin, attending the Consumer Goods Forum, and I'll be discussing another key finding from the report, which was a really interesting one, a very counterintuitive one, which is what is the role of kindness in leadership? When we think about leadership attributes, we don't necessarily think about kindness as one of them. And yet our report and our research found that kindness is actually extremely important in the way that we need to lead today. So I look forward to talking to you in a week. Until then, take care and all the best.